Florence and the Machine.
I'm familiar.
Whoa, who knew?
I'm familiar with the song, just not the Florence part.
You didn't know it was Florence?
No.
Yeah, they were popular in like the 2010 era. The dirty hipsters. Dirty as in like looking dirty.
I was gonna say.
Not as like, those dirty hipsters.
Dirty hipsters.
Get a job, you dirty hipster. Some of them are still hanging on. So, anyway, we ready?
I think we're ready.
All right, here we go. Hello, everybody. That was too much.
Welcome to season.
Whoa! Hello, everybody. That was a lot. We're here. This is If I Had an Opinion. I'm Jeremiah. That's Nigel. That's Gordon. Got a short episode to introduce our new episodes. We no longer have a wheel. We exhausted the wheel and then also got sick a lot, so just stopped doing it. So you don't get to hear about women in ministry.
Now you said it. Now you said it. Now
find out about that.
They wouldn't have known.
They would have. It was on other. We mentioned it multiple times. So you'll have to find that out about other podcasts. Read a book.
It's not coming from us.
Who reads books?
Yeah.
The Bible mainly, stuff like that. So we're going to be going through some theology stuff. Our goal is kind of to give you guys kind of the vocabulary and history of some of the main parts of theology that maybe we couldn't get into on a Sunday morning, or we might mention in passing on a Sunday morning, but kind of go into the more depth.
That's part of your bingo square when I play.
What? Theology?
You have a theological term.
Yeah, random theology terms is a thing I like to do. Just here's a theology term for you. So we're going to go into more of them in theory in the next coming weeks. We don't know how long this will take.
We don't know how long it'll take.
No idea. We're not going to be the most in-depth history you can find.
Oh, no.
You'd also have to read a book for that.
Or take a class or whatever it is.
So many other things. But we're going to try to generally give kind of where the doctrines were formalized and the history of them.
And not just like, here, this is the thing, let's talk about the thing, but to kind of see how that took place over the course of church history. Like there are periods of time in which elements of what we now have as the faith that's been preserved were the primary focus of the church, and there's other times when it's been other things. So hopefully it kind of integrates church history with theology so that they don't seem like they're in isolated units by themselves.
Right. So in preparation for this, shaved my head so I could look like a professor from Southern Theological Seminary. And
There are better seminaries.
That's fine. Wow, that's messed up. But so now we've got that going. I have a quote I'm going to read from this book. I think I stole this book from you.
You did, yeah.
It's called Theology for the Community of God. And it says this: theology then is the task of the faith community. It is a community act. Theology is the Christian community, reflecting on and articulating the faith of the people who have encountered God and God's activity as focused in the history of Jesus of Nazareth, and who therefore seek to live as the people of God in the contemporary world. Ultimately, then, the propositions of systematic theology find their source and aim in the identity and life of the community it serves. In fact, we need no other rationale to engage in the discipline than our participation in the church. And as Theodore Jennings rightly notes, theological reflection is reflection on behalf of a community, a tradition, and a world. And so that is kind of the reason for us going into this, is that we're, as a church, supposed to also kind of be theologically educated. So part of the Great Commission is teaching all the things that Christ commands, but also that includes us knowing about God, who He is, all the things He has done. And so we're going to get more into the weeds of theological discussions.
Because every world religion is trying to answer those questions. Like
Yep.
It isn't Christianity that has a God and everybody else has no form of deity. It's just they're looking at the human condition. They're looking at the bigger questions that exist in the world, and they're giving different answers for where those things come from. Like Paul never really, when he engaged in those apologetics, when we see in Acts anyway, he doesn't try to just destroy every theological construct they have. What he's trying to do is give the Christian understanding of who God is and the theological implications of that. And in some ways, he kind of leaves it up to the participant or the hearer to decide whether or not they come to the same conclusions that he does, some propositional truth in that. But part of what that book is describing in that definition of theology is that it isn't just a theology of the church. Our theology is what we're giving to the world as not just a defense of our faith, but also as an evangelistic tool to say, this is who the God that's revealed in Scripture describes himself to be. This is how he describes community. This is the theology that governs our actions. Is this what you want to be a part of? And then we get into the weeds of, well, what's being born again, what's being part of the church. But theology is an evangelistic tool.
Right. And I think part of it is also like we are meant to do theology in community, just like we're meant to do studying scripture in a community, in the sense that like the Bereans and Acts are spoken of as when Paul comes and preaches to them, they then go as like, it's not just like individually, but they all go and are like, okay, let's compare this to the scripture. So hopefully, as you guys watch this, that you'll compare this to scripture, but also that'll be kind of our goal, is to look through these, when we're making decisions on, or when we're talking about like our view of a certain theology, that the basis of that is that its authority is in scripture. So we're going to skip over, typically, systematic theologies start with the Bible. We've talked about the Bible a bunch, and we could always go back into it, but I think probably we've got that covered. So we're going to skip a theology of Scripture. We believe it's infallible, inerrant, all the general Christian beliefs about the Bible.
Probably should preface, we won't have the answers for all the theological questions.
Well, I think there are some that will believe we're closer to the answer than others.
We'll try.
Yeah.
I think that's just, we don't pretend to have all the answers, but we are going to do our best to give it best as we understand them currently. Right. Yeah. And as we talked about, there are essential doctrines that we won't change our minds on.
Exactly. Even essential doctrines that are confusing, like the Trinity, that we may not have a great. We have a way that we say it through church history, that this is the way that you explain the Trinity, and that's it. And don't try to make other weird things happen with it, and you just move on. Yeah, that's what we believe, and we believe that by faith. And so there is that aspect too. So today we have a short episode, mostly to introduce this concept, but then we're going to go through this week and next week, the incommunicable attributes of God. So first we have to know, what does the word incommunicable mean? So incommunicable attributes are ones that God has that are less shared with us, rather than, so there's in some sense, so we're going to talk about like the eternity of God today. There's a sense in which we will be immortal, and so we will live for eternity, but we are not eternal beings because we don't exist outside of time, and so we weren't in the beginning.
We didn't have a...
There's not a soul bank.
We had a beginning state. Soul bank.
Soul bank theory is the fun one, where God has just a pool of souls, and it's like, there you go.
Yep. I think that's a body for
the movie Soul, right? Isn't that? Yeah, there you go. So if you want to know about soul bank theory, you can watch the movie Soul on Disney Plus.
Because Disney Plus. That's where I'm going for my theology.
Sometimes. A lot of people. So they're incommunicable in that they're less shared with us. So while we may have some part of it, the communicable attributes of God are going to be things like knowledge and wisdom, that those are attributes that we share as being in his likeness. The incommunicable are ones we do not share, even though we are in his likeness. Yeah. And so that saves us from kind of like a little God's doctrine.
Right, like they don't translate, even though Genesis tells us that we're made in the image of God, some elements of who God is do not translate over to us, because they're not supposed to be little gods in a genetic sense, where we are a created being by the divine Godhead.
It would be fun to be omnipresent, though.
Omnipresent would be great, but that is a good example of an incommunicable attribute. I literally cannot be anywhere but here right now.
That's right.
So God is everywhere. So there we go. There's an incommunicable attribute. So today we're going to talk about God's aseity and his eternity. So aseity is just a fancy word. So there's our vocabulary word for the day. Aseity. It means independence. So God does not need us to rest or the rest of creation for anything, yet we and the rest of creation can glorify him and bring him joy. So this is the idea that, and this is in Acts 17, this is also kind of the idea of, I had a verse and it left me, so we'll get back to it.
It'll come back.
But, Job. I think this is a big deal in Job, is that when Job speaks to God, God's response is like, where were you? And that God's creation of the things he didn't depend on them. He was the thing that they all depend on. And so he is independent of needing anything else. There didn't have to be anything else in existence for God to exist, and nothing has to exist for him to exist, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so that is how we get to a creation out of nothing, is because God is independent from things. So we didn't have to have a cause for God.
Exactly. And I think that's really the key part is God is uncaused. He is the eternally existent being. So before there were things that we attach that are relative, whether they're time or space, he existed beyond those things that give us dimension. And usually that relativity is what gives color and shape and definition. And so that's how we can recognize the existence of something, is because it is in relationship to other material elements. And God is immaterial. Scripture says that he is spirit. And so beyond our ability to fathom is a being that exists that does not require any other dimensions to be present to
Right.
either.
And I hoped we would not get to Thomas Aquinas so quickly. But this is what is called the Cosmological Argument, which was formalized by Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s. And so he is kind of the doctor of the church at that time.
Yeah.
And so is the most important theologian to the Catholic Church in those days. And most of what he does is apologetics, or like arguments for the existence of God. And the main one is the cosmological argument that everything has a cause. But there has to be a stop to that chain of events, or it goes on for eternity. And so there has to be a first cause, which causes all other causes. And that first cause we call God. And so that is a argument for deism, rather than an argument necessarily for a Christian
God
God,
specifically,
but it
yeah.
argues for the existence of a being outside of dependence on creation.
Yeah,
And
and that's C.S. Lewis's perspective too. When that whole when you find something that doesn't fit the world you're a part of, it tells you that there's another world out there. So he says, there's things within us that testify that there's a dimension beyond ourselves, regardless of how well we explain it. So if we can get to the point of acknowledging that is real, then we're looking at a series of other details that tell us whether or not the God of the Bible is the true and living God, or the God of other scriptures or other religious perspectives. So one of the first things that we as humans do is acknowledge that there is something that exists outside of us. Now what's that thing? And Scripture reveals that that's what we call the Bible, the revelation of God.
And so that's why Paul can say that in him we move and live and have our being, is because he is independent of us and we are dependent on him. So that is an incommunicable attribute. It's that we are all dependent on causes. We are all dependent on this world. We are all dependent on God to even keep breathing. And so that is a difference between us. And I think that ties really well to the eternity of God, that God doesn't have a beginning. And so it's a different part of the same argument. That
That's right.
as far as time goes, God is in some way outside of time, even though in Scripture and in our lives we see him working within time. So it's not Doctor Who time, where he is randomly going to different parts of time and he's on his own timeline and our timeline's over here, and he is like, oh, I'll go over here now and then I'll go into the past now. And he decides to interact with humans on our timeline that we are presently on.
Which is a thing he created.
Right.
Before, as part of creating creation, he created time, which is an element by which we measure other things. But it means that there's chronology, and in that chronology, there are things that evolve. Like we have, whether it's special evolution. I'm a 6-day creationist, so I think it's microevolution. But there's things that develop as they interact with the environment. There's progressive revelation that we see in Scripture, where our understanding of God in the Old Testament is one way, and he continues to reveal himself over time so that we have a fuller understanding of who God is. So what time does is it limits, or it measures the speed at which we grow and we create knowledge and we understand and interact. And God is before all of that stuff happens. So time is something that is purely for more our benefit, like the experience of material beings, so that we can tell the difference between one reality and another.
Right. And the main argument for this would be John 1, Genesis 1, in the beginning, God. And so he's already there.
Yeah.
And in the beginning is like, that's the beginning of time.
Yep.
And then at someday time will end and we will be with God forever. And so there will be a sense, this is where this becomes sort of communicable, is that there is a sense in which we will exist forever with him later. But now we are mortal and we
Or
are...
without him forever.
Right, there
Or
you go.
without,
Yeah,
yeah.
with or without.
That's right.
So we as Christians will exist with him forever, is the we I was trying to refer to. But so we will be, in that sense, eternal on the back end, but none of us has pre-existed. And
That's right.
so we have a day you were born and there is a day you will die. And so, or caught up like Enoch, I guess. I guess you got to make the Enoch, Elijah...
Exception.
There's two of those. So since there's two of them, that there's those guys, but those were set dates that those things happened, and then every human to be in existence, except for Jesus, has not been pre-existent. And so John 1 tells us that in the beginning Jesus was also there, and so that gets into our kind of theology of the Trinity, but that all three persons of the Trinity have always existed. Before time, they existed. And that is an important doctrine for us, because that means that the God we serve is the real God. And so when we see other powers at work in the world, those are not the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so that is what we see in Scripture also. So
when specifically in regards to those two elements or incommunicable attributes, those are the things that tell us that he is not also affected by the ongoing changes of creation. Like we have differing levels, like you mentioned Aquinas, like he's at the beginning end of the Enlightenment where we're going to have all of this technology that meets up with our philosophy, and there's, the world gets changed. But God doesn't succumb to that. He's not affected by the things that are affecting us in our universe, and that's why because he exists outside of that, he is the rock that never moves, right? He is unmovable in our theology because he's not susceptible to the changes that we experience in the world. It doesn't matter how barbaric a civilization is or how advanced a civilization is, God isn't affected by the things that determine those things. And so all of creation, everything that exists, whether it's time and space and matter and all of these dimensions, they are all existent outside of God, which means that God is infinitely larger than any of the infinitely large things we can imagine. So it not only enhances our understanding specifically of the character of God, but the other elements, the omnipresence and the omnipotence, and just the things that make him beyond our ability to fathom. So then once you see how enormous God is, then when you zoom in and you think, well, man-made religion is us trying to create a God kind of that appeals to our senses or appeals to our consciences or whatever, and we realize that God would be limited by the world in which we inhabit. And it's like a self-refuting argument that if there's a God that we can conceive of, then that's not the God that has pre-existed all things.
Yep. And so then, I guess application-wise, the way this affects our theology going forward is that when Scripture talks of God as being the one who is and was and forever will be, like these kind of ideas, that is where our faith gets placed.
That's right.
So Job says he spoke of things he could not understand, because God is like, where were you when I created the world? Like, where were you before time existed? And so we are believing in a God who can save us because he is eternal, because he is independent. And that is the God who steps into time and steps into creation to save people, to redeem people to himself. And he can do that because he is a God who is eternal and independent. And so if he wasn't that, then we would have to question whether or not he has the power to do what he says he can do.
That's right.
And so I think that's kind of the big idea of incommunicable attributes, is it allows us to see how big God is, and so when he makes promises, then we can trust them. And so kind of the idea of this part of systematic theology is that the God that we're going to be looking at all these different parts of, and all these different ideas around, is a God who can be trusted because of who he is, and the things that he doesn't share with any other being.
Yeah.
And so I think probably that covers it.
Yeah. But part of it too is where we constantly look for answers. It's kind of how we're built. We're built to be curious and to wonder. because part of us is designed to, I mean, all of us was designed to, but in the fall, there's only that remnant within us that is really looking to worship and to glorify something outside of us. So in that relational element, as we're asking ourselves these big questions, sometimes we bump up against things that we feel like until we can answer that question, then is that a God that we want to serve? Is that it's like, well, we're not putting God beneath our understanding so that he's subservient to our intellect. We do have to arrive at some junctions in our life where we are making steps of faith that are beyond our reason. They are beyond our ability to conceptualize and fathom. And yeah, there'll be some elements in which we can do that more successfully than others. You know, the Trinity is one of those things. The problem of evil, the understanding that there would be a God who would be an eternal judge when, like, why is that part of his character? Like, all these things that we now can bring as accusations against God, they are founded in our inability to see the beginning from the end of all things. And so it's a part of our Christian journey, is a continual reminder that God is independent of all things, that he's not just kind of hoping things work out so that it goes in his favor. Like, he's not susceptible to our whims.
Yeah. So, do you have anything to add?
No.
Okay, great. So that's kind of going to be what we're going to be doing. Most of these episodes will probably be longer, but figure we start with some easy stuff, which is that God is beyond our comprehension. It's simple, no big deal. And we'll move on from there. If you have theology questions that you've always wanted to know, or things that you have questions about, even what we just talked about now, you can send them to podcast@parksidevisalia.org. Remember to rate, subscribe, review, all that good jazz. And until next time.